אז שלום לכולם, ברוכים הבאים למושב שלנו. המושב הזה עוסק בתהליכים מרתקים על יציאת הקבלה ממרחבה המסורתי והמפגש שלה עם המודרניות דרך עיבוד, תיווך והתמודדות עם זהויות משתנות. אנחנו נבחן 3 מקרי מבחן לעניין הזה, המדגימים כיצד הקבלה נתפסת, מתורגמת ומעוצבת מחדש במרחבים הרוחניים, הספרותיים והאקדמיים. הדובר הראשון שלנו הוא אביעד גולדמן. איפה אביעד? הנה בו. דוקטורנט במכון בן-גוריון לחקר ישראל בקמפוס דה בוקר. אביעד יעסוק בכתביו של הזר ויבחן את השימוש בדימויים של לבוש ופנימיות להבנת הדרכים שבהם הזר מעצב את תודעתו הרוחנית והספרותית ביחס לקבלה. בבקשה.
תודה רבה, מרגש מאוד להיות בכנס הזה, להיות שותף, אז תודה רבה. בהרצאה הזאת אני מבקש לגעת ביחסו של הסופר אלכסנדר זיסקין רבינוביץ', או בקיצור, הזר, לקבלה. אמנם אפשר לנסות ולזהות את היחס לקבלה ואת השימוש שנעשה בה אצל סופרים רבים, אולי נדמה לי שהזר הוא מהווה מקרה יוצא דופן שדורש התייחסות מיוחדת. קצת רקע. הזר היה סופר עברי פורה. יצירתו הקיפה תחומים רבים, סיפורת, תרגום, היסטוריה, חינוך, חברה, פובליציסטיקה, מחקר ופרשנות. הוא החל לדרכו הספרותית כמשכיל עברי, הצטרף לתנועה הציונית בעקבות מפח נפש שחווה מצד תנועת ההשכלה ברוסיה, וביחד עם מורים וסופרים נוספים הוא נמנה על שורותיה של אגודת בני משה של אחד העם. סיפוריו עסקו בפערי מעמדות, וזיקו אותו בתואר חלוץ הסיפורת הסוציאליסטית העברית. הוא עלה לארץ בשנת 1906, בגיל 52, מחילה ממי שעבר פה את הגיל, הוא כונה הישיש או הסבא, והוא שימש כמעין דמות אב לסופרי העלייה השנייה. הוא היה יהודי אדוק, הוא זכה למעמד דתי בתנועת העבודה החילונית. למשל, הוא נודע כמסדר הקידושין ועורך החופות של יצחק בן-צבי, שאנחנו נמצאים בסריף הזה, הוא חיתן אותו ואת רחל ינאית, יוסף חיים ברנר, סידר את הקידושין שלו, וכן הלאה. הוא זכה לגינוני כבוד כמעין אדמו"ר חסידי בקיני הנוער העובד והלומד, וקשר מיוחד היה לו עם הרב אברהם יצחק הכהן קוק, רבה של יפו, שעוד נדבר עליו בהמשך. כולנו מכירים את הזר בעיקר מהסיפור של לאה גולדברג, המפוזר מכפר הזר. הכפר הזר הוקם לרגל יום הולדתו ה-85, כאות הוקרה, לא ציפו שהוא יאריך ימים, ב-1945, בגיל 91, הוא נפטר. מסכת חייו הארוכה של הזר היא מהווה תמיל ייחודי, שמשלב בין עולם ישן אל מול עולם חדש. דמותו ופעילותו הענפה יצרה סינתזה ייחודית בין הפכים, בין קודש לחול ובין תפיסות עולם מנוגדות. דומני ששאלת הקבלה בכתביו, בייחוד לאור המעמד הדתי המיוחד שלא זכה, יכולה לשפוך אור על זוויות נוספות במקומה של הקבלה בנרטיב הציוני. כך יש להוסיף, אריכות ימיו והעובדה כי חצה בחייו הן את ההשכלה והן את הציונות, מהווה אבן בוחן נוספת בעלת חשיבות ביחס לקבלה. הזר גדל בלאדי, ערש חסידות חב"ד. אביו ודודו היו מייסדי בית המדרש החסידי בעיר, מילדותו גדל בחצר החסידית של רבי חיים שניאור זלמן שניאורסון, חצר שהתפצלה לאחר פטירתו של האדמו"ר השלישי של חב"ד, בעל הצמח צדק. בחקר חסידות חב"ד, זיכרונותיו של הזר על החצר הזאת נחשבים לאחד המקורות הבודדים והמרכזיים אודותיה, אולי היחידים. בשנת תרמ"ט פרסם הזר באלמנח הספרותי האסיף, בעריכת נחום סוקולוב, שאפשר לראות פה בתמונה, מאמר בשם תולדות משפחת שניאורזון. המאמר הזה היה יוצא דופן בנוף הציוני משכילי, וספג אף ביקורת נוקבת. הוא נכתב כתגובה למאמר של פסח רודרמן, השקפה כללית על הצדיקים ועל החסידים, שפורסם בכתב עת השחר, ומטרתו המוצהרת הייתה לגעת בתולדות חסידות חב"ד, אבל מתוך נקודת מבט אוהדת. אפשר לראות פה את המיניפסט שהוא נותן ככה בתחילת המאמר. מקצוע אחד יש בדברי ימינו, אשר כמעט לא נגע בו יד סופר, והוא תולדות משפחת שניאורזון, אשר כמעט במשך שנה פעולה נמרצת, הליכות הקורות לכן יושבי רוסיה. אם אמנם אחדים דיברו בה, שנאתם לקבלה ולחסידות תבטא את עיניהם, עד כי בשגגה ובזדון הוציאו משפט מעוקל. כפי שהעריך חמוטל בר יוסף, המאמר הזה נכתב בתוך הקשר רחב של פריחה נאו-מיסטית במזרח אירופה, ושימש כביטוי למאבק זהותי של משכילי רוסיה כנגד חוכמת ישראל הגרמנית. לכן הוא נכתב בכוונת מכוון בסגנון מחקרי מערבי, אבל מתוך נקודת מבט פנים יהודית מזרח אירופאית אוהדת. יש כמובן הרבה מאוד מה לדון על המאמר הזה, ואנחנו נתמקד ספציפית בתפיסת הקבלה שמשתקפת ממנו. ברייט כצלנסון מספר לנו כמה המאמר הזה חשוב בנרטיב הציוני. מאמר זה מלא הערצת החסידות החבדית, נכתב לפני דובנוב, לפני פרס, לפני ברדיצ'בסקי, תכף נדבר על ברדיצ'בסקי, לפני יהודה שטיינברג, בטרם הייתה חסידות מטבע עובר לסוחר, זה לא בדיוק נכון, אבל זה לא משנה, זה מה שנתקבע. את המאמר פתח חזר בקביעה אודות השימוש הנרחב שעשתה החסידות בקבלה. לבל ילכדו בני ישראל בפח ההשכלה הפרוצה. את הדברים הוא ניסח במשל. משל לעגלת סוחר שטעונה משי יקר וחשופה לכיפת השמיים. פתאום מתחיל לרדת גשם שוטף, מבול של ממש, ורע נאמן עוזר לסוחר ומכסה את העגלה על סחורותיה היקרה בסמיכה. הנמשל פשוט. היהדות האמיתית, הנגלית, המעשית, התורה והמצוות, ההלכה, היא הסחורה היקרה, וההשכלה היא המים הזידונים, שבאים להשחית כל חלקה טובה. תורת הקבלה היא סמיכה מרופטת שנועדה להגן על היהדות. לא מן הנמנע שהביקורת כנגד ההשכלה נשענת על היבטים ביוגרפיים של הזר, ובחשבון הפתוח של תנועת ההשכלה היהודית הרוסית שעליה נמנה בשנות נערותו. על כל פנים, כדאי להתעכב על המשל הזה, משל הפנים והחוץ. הפנים והחוץ מקבלים אצל הזר משמעויות שונות מהמקובל. האזוטריקה, הנסתר, הפנימיות, פנימיות התורה הופכת להיות לבוש, שכל מטרתו להגן על הדבר האמיתי. לדבריו חסידות חב"ד הסתנה במיוחד בשימוש בלבוש הקבלי, חומר נפיץ שבימים עברו, ימי שבתאי צבי היו לאבן נגף לבית ישראל, והשימוש שחב"ד עשתה בו הייתה מדוד, שכלי ומבוקר, מתוך הכרה וידיעה ברורה כי המעשה הוא יסוד היהדות. לא כוונות, לא ייחודים, לא תיאוסופיה ולא תיאורגיה. בהמשך המאמר, ביסס הזר את דבריו מכמה ציטוטים מתוך קונטרס ההתפעלות של האדמו"ר האמצעי. הוא טען בין היתר כי אין הבדל של ממש בין קבלה להשכלה. שניהם אופנות רעיוניות שניתנות לפרש ולהתפרש עם היהדות המקורית. כאשר ההשכלה עושה נזק, באה הקבלה לתקן. הזר לא העריך את הקבלה במיוחד. עבורו הייתה סמיכה מרופטת. הביקורת עליה הייתה ביקורת משכילית קלאסית מבית היוצר של רנק. פילוסופיה שהתקלקלה לכדי דמיונות ולעיתים גם טיפשות של ממש. מגמה זאת פיתח יצחק בר לוינסון, שיונתן הזכיר פה בהרצאה קודמת, אבל יחד עם זאת הוא ראה בקבלה ערך גדול בתפקיד שידעו לה חסידים, לשמור על ההלכה. נסכם בדבריו המרגשים של הזר, אהבתיכם חסידים יקרים, מי ייתן לי ידיים ארוכות וחיבקתי אתכם ולחסתי אתכם אל ליבי, די לי כי בקרבכם בוערת אהבת תורתנו הקדושה כאש, אף אם תלבישוה לבוש, על פי דעתי לא נבלה, הלבוש הוא הקבלה. הביקורת לא הכרעה לבוא, ודומה שהביקורת הנוקבת ביותר, ואולי גם הארסית ביותר, הייתה ביקורתו של מיכה יוסף ברדיצ'בסקי. אתם יכולים לראות פה איך הוא צוחק עליו, כמעט באותה מילים. ברדיצ'בסקי הצעיר החל אף הוא באותה תקופה להרבות חקר בתולדות ובקורות החסידות. שמואל ורסס הצביע על העובדה כי באותן השנים ברדיצ'בסקי התאמץ להוכיח כי החסידות לא נוגדת את ההשכלה אלא אדרבה, היא הכניסה לתוך תוככי הקהילות היהודיות רעיונות של חירות ונאורות. אין פלא איפה שהמאמר של הזר נגע בנקודות רגישות. ברדיצ'בסקי מתח ביקורת חריפה על צורת הביוגרפיה הפגומה של הזר, שאינה עומדת בסטנדרטים מערביים, וכמובן גם על התוכן. הביקורת היא כמעט מובנת מאליה. החסידות קמה כתנועת תחיה דתית מתוך פרשנות ייחודית לקבלת הרמ"ק, בטח ובטח שלא כתגובת נגד להשכלה. ואני מוסיף, אכן מספיק לפתוח פסקה אקראית בספר התניא, ולגלות שהעולם החב"די רואה במציאות כולה לבוש לנסתר, ולא להפך. אני מבקש לטעון כי הזר ידע את העובדות ההיסטוריות עליהן נרצה ברדיצ'בסקי בשסף קצף. ההיפוך בין הנסתר לבין הנגלה, בין הלבוש לבין הפנימיות, הוא היפוך מכוון. הטענה היא טענה אפולוגטית, מגמתית וחינוכית, שמבקשת לחזק את מסורת ישראל סבא, וביתר שאת את ההלכה, ולהעביר את מוקד ההתרחשות והבשורה הדתית מהרוח אל המעשה. כדי לחזק את הטענה הזאת, נדמה לי שיש לעמוד על דימויו העצמי של הזר, ולהתעמק במחלוקת בינו לבין ברדיצ'בסקי בשאלה אחרת, שאלת תפקידה של הספרות. ברדיצ'בסקי הוא ללא ספק הרומנטיקן החשוב ביותר בספרותנו, כך קבע גרשון שקד. ברדיצ'בסקי ביקש להחיות את המיתוס היהודי, הוא ראה בהגדה, במיסטיקה וברוח החסידית את נשמת אפה של החיות היהודית שהתנבנה ברבות השנים בקבלי המסורת וההלכה. הזר לעומת זאת היה סופר ריאליסט, מבחירי זרם המהלך החדש, ובלשונו של יוסף חיים ברנר, אמונת חייו של הזר רחוקה מכל מיסטיקה, מכל ערפיליות, ריאליטי. הזר הוא מן הריאליסטים הכי מעולים בספרותנו החדשה. תודעתו העצמית של הזר הייתה תודעה של ריאליסט, הבוחר לצייר את הפשט על פני תיאור הנסתר. בביקורת על הריאליסמוס, כאילו על הריאליזם, כן? קבע ברדיצ'בסקי, הספירות העליונות, הנשמה היתרה המופלאה והמכוסה שם לפנים מן הקלעים פינו מקום לטבע הגלוי, לפשוטם של החיים, לצרכי האדם הרגילים והתמידיים שנעשו לעיקר הווייתו. לכן, הזר הסופר הריאליסט ביקר את המעשה, הריאליה קודמת לאזוטריקה והנגלה קודם לנסתר. השימוש הספרותי בריאליזם אצל גדולי הספרות הרוסית, טולסטוי, טוסטויבסקי ועוד, ביקשו לא רק לתאר את הקיים, אלא גם לעורר לתיקון עמוק של המציאות. ומה שיפה ונכון לסגנון ספרותי, הפך אצל הזר לאורח חיים של ממש. הזר היה פעיל פוליטית. לא במקרה עם עלייתו לארץ, הוא הפך להיות מדוברי המרכזיים של תנועת העבודה, כמטיף למעשה, לעבודה עברית כשרה, לפרודוקטיביות. בכמה מקומות הוא כתב כי הוא מבקר את המעשה על פני הנשמע, כלומר, עשייה על פני הגות פילוסופית תהיה אשר תהיה. במחקר שלי, אני מנסה להוכיח כי ממפעליו הספרותיים השונים ביקש הזר לעצב מיתוס, לקדש מציאות. ציטוט אחד, מטרתנו לחנך דור עובדים בכל מקום ובייחוד בארץ ישראל, זה חפצנו, העובדים הישרים הם יביאו את המשיח, הם בעצמם יהיו המשיח. טענה זאת מסבירה היטב גם את היחסים המיוחדים שהיו לעזר עם הרב קוק. עזר נודע כאחד מן האורחים הראשונים של כתביו, מהבודדים שהורשו לעיין בפנקסיו המיסטיים. הוא היה הביוגרף הראשון שכתב מסה מקיפה על אישיותו של הרב קוק, כתר תורה. הוא היווה כסוכן דת שמקשר בין בית הרב לבין הגוורדיה הספרותית של העלייה השנייה. עגנון, יצרימון, שלמה צמח, שין בן ציון, ברנר ועוד ועוד. הזר תפס את הרב קוק לא רק כרב גדול או סופר גדול, אלא גם כבעל נפש פיוטית וכמשורר. פתגמו הוא, האדם הוא מיסטי בטבע. רוחו של האדם שואפת אל מה שאין לו גבול ותכלית. בשנת תרס"ט הוא ערך את קובץ הניר, כתב עת שבו תלה הרב קוק תקוות גדולות שלא לומר משיחיות. על פי כתר תורה, היה הניר ניסיון ספרותי חלוצי להנגיש את הרעיונות הקבליים של הרב קוק לציבור. פרשת עריכת כתביו של הזר עמד יונתן מאיר בצורה מקיפה. יש הטוענים כי יחסו של הזר לדת ולקבלה השתנה באופן נחרץ בעת עלייתו לארץ בעקבות המפגש עם הרב קוק. עיון מדוקדק בכתבי הזר מעלה שעם כל הכבוד שהוא רכש לרב של יפו, לפחות היחס למקובלים לא השתנה באופן מהותי. בספרו תולדות היהודים בארץ ישראל שנכתב בראשית שנות ה-20, ספר שמטרתו היה להראות רצף יהודי ביישוב היהודי מחורבן הבית עד ימיו, ספר תיאר את מקובלי צפת כהוזים, את רבי יוסף קארו כמדמיין מגידים, ואת הארי כרואה רוחות. בסיפור מחרבונות החלוקה שנכתב ב-1919, הוא מציג את הקבלה כעולם טהור, אך מנותק מהווי העולם הזה, שאינו מוכן להתעמת עם מציאות קולקלת, לזעוק על עוולות חברתיות ושחיתות מוסרית. אני טוען כי פעילותו של הזר עם הרב קוק הייתה חלק מתפיסה ריאליסטית שבה הוא דגל, תפיסה שביקשה לתת ממד של קדושה לחיי חולין, אך בלי צורך במיסטיקה. בקוצר הזמן אני לא אוכל לעסוק בנושא הזה בהרחבה, בהזדמנות אחרת, אבל לעצם הדיון שלנו הזר מיצב את הרב קוק, את המקובל כמשורר, כרומנטיקן, ואילו את עצמו כאיש פרוזה, כלומר כמי שעסוק בבניית נרטיבים באמצעות תיאור המציאות. ולכן הוא נטל על עצמו את תפקיד העורך, לתרגם רוח לספרות, לעצב שירה לפרוזה. את דברי התורה להפוך לנרטיב ציוני. ראיה לדבר ניתן למצוא בהתכתבות מרתקת אל הסופר אשר בן ישראל, מילה על אשר בן ישראל, מן הסופרים העבריים הבודדים שהתעסקו עם קבלה בשנות ה-10 של המאה ה-20, הוא לא היה מעורך במיוחד, אפשר לומר שהזר פרס עליו את חסיותו. ספרו שירת תחיה יצא בהוצאה עצמית של הזר, הספר זכה להתייחסות מחקרית מזערית במאמר קצר של אלחנן ריינר. בקצרה, הוא מתאר את ספרות הזוהר כשירה, מה שמכונה היום הפואטיקה של הזוהר. מעניין לראות מאמרים של ליבס ולהשוות לאשר בן ישראל, ממש דומה. לצורך העניין, לעניין שלנו, הזר התבקש לכתוב הקדמה לספר הזה, והוא לא הספיק, ובסופו של דבר כתב בן ישראל את ההקדמה בעצמו. הזר נחשף להקדמה, וכך הוא כותב לו. ברכתי עליה שהחיינו, בסגנונך אני רואה את השפעת רבנו קוק לטובה. טוב עשיתי שלא כתבתי אני את ההקדמה. פרוזאי אנוכי. יותר מדי טוב בשבילי לעודד ולהסתכל מרחוק, איך הכהן אשר חנן השם אותו בעבודת מתנה, נכנס לתוך הדביר בענן התקשרות, ולזר אסור לגשת שמה. נסכם. הזר ראה בקבלה לבוש לפנימיות היהודית לחיי המעשה. נטייתו של הזר לריאליזם ולפרוזה לא הייתה רק טעם אומנותי, היא בחירה מודעת. הוא הכיר בכך שהוא אינו כהן בעבודת הסוד, הוא ריאליסט, לא איש שירה. הוא הביט מבחוץ, ואולי אף עודד את העוסקים במיסטיקה או פילוסופיה, אך אינו חצה את הגבול אל תחומם. את העיקר הוא תפס בחיי המעשה, בקידוש המעשה, שהוא עיקר ויסוד היהדות. תודה רבה.
טוב, תענוג שלא היה צריך להפסיק אותו אפילו. אז שאלות.
רציתי לשאול איך הזר היה רואה, או איך היה תופס את הרבי מלובביץ'. מה לפי דעתך?
וואי, שאלה טובה ממש. הזר נשאר קשור לחסידות חב"ד בעצם עד יום יומו האחרון. הוא היה הולך להתוועדויות של יד קיסלב, מנגן ניגונים חסידיים, אבל הרב צבי יהודה כותב עליו שהוא חסיד חב"ד, למרות שהוא לא היה חסיד חב"ד כבר, אבל הוא נשאר קשור לחסידות חב"ד, היה בקשר עם הרב החב"די של יפו, שכחתי את שמו כרגע. איך הוא היה רואה את הרבי מלובביץ'? זו שאלה מעניינת. אני חושב שהוא היה אוהב אותו. בסוף הזר הוא עושה הרבה פופולריזציה, כמו שהרבי מלובביץ' היה עושה, אבל הזר לא היה מיסטיקן. בסוף אני חושב שחלק מהנרטיב הציוני היה להתרחק מהקבלה ולעסוק בחיי המעשה. ולכן אולי הוא היה מעריך את הרבי מלובביץ' כמו שהוא היה מעריך את הרב קוק. עד כמה הוא היה מזדהה לגמרי עם כל מה שהוא אומר? לא יודע.
אתה יכול להגיד עוד, תודה רבה קודם כל, אתה יכול להגיד עוד כמה מילים על, דיברת על הוויכוח בינו לבין ברדיצ'בסקי שהוא הרומנטיקן, ומצד שני דיברת על הפואטיקה של הקבלה, זאת אומרת על הערכת תפקיד המשורר, כן, זה נשמע דווקא שיח מאוד רומנטי, אז אתה יכול לחדד רגע את טבע הוויכוח או את ההבדלים ביניהם?
הזר מעודד את אשר בן ישראל, הוא עוזר לרב קוק, הוא רואה בזה איזשהו חלק, אבל הוא עצמו לא עוסק בזה. הזר לא כותב שירה, יש לו בארכיון תנועת העבודה, שהארכיון שלו נמסר לשמה, הארכיון שלו מפוזר מכפר הזר, הארכיון שלו באמת מפוזר בכמה מקומות שונים, בבית פיאליק, במכון גנזים, במכון לבון, ושם יש איזה שיר אחד שהוא כותב, שיר מאוד לא מוצלח, הוא מפסיק אותו באמצע, אני חושב שהוא הכיר את ערכו, זאת אומרת, הוא העריך את הקבלה, הוא ראה באיזשהו עולם טהור, נסתר, איזשהו משהו כזה, אבל בעיניו העיקר היה המעשה. אז הוא מעודד את העוסקים במלאכה, אבל מה שהוא אומר שם בסוף לאשר בן ישראל, אני לא חוצה את גבול תחומכם. אתם הכהנים בעבודת הסוד, אני נשאר בחוץ, אני בונה מיתוס, אתם דולים מיתוס. אולי משהו כזה.
אתה מדבר בדרכו של הזר על הקבלה. עכשיו אנחנו כאן, אני חושב כולנו בחדר חניכים של major trends, זאת אומרת קבלות. האם יש איזו תפיסה אצלו שהקבלה היא בעצם המון דברים, או שהוא רואה אותה איזו מין ישות אימננטית אחת שעוסקת
זו שאלה מצוינת, הוא רואה אותה כישות אחת, וברדיצ'בסקי בביקורת שלו אומר לו, זה הרבה קבלות. זאת אומרת, אתה לא יכול לערבב בין תיאורגיה לבין תיאולוגיה. בדיוק, נכון. הוא לא עושה את החלוקה הזאת, וזה חלק מהביקורת עליו.
תודה רבה, אביעד. כל הכבוד. טוב, הדובר השני שלנו זה ברק, אבל אני אציג אותו באנגלית כי הוא דבר באנגלית. אז our second speaker is Barak Hoffman, a doctoral candidate at the Hebrew University in the Barbara Mandel program, under the supervision of Professor Yonatan Garb. Barak's research focuses on Lurianic Kabbalah, and he has published several articles, most recently on Meir Mina, one of the great Kabbalists of the 20th century in Iraq. Today Barak will speak about Dr. David Slutzkin, a Sharabian Kabbalist at the Hebrew University, at the Hebrew University Talmud Department. בבקשה ברק.
So I will start with a personal story, how I came across this really unique story. When I was a young lad, my grandfather called me and he told me, I heard you're very interested in Kabbalah. I want to tell you you're not the first one in the family. And I was quite surprised because the Slutzkin family are not very mystical. He says, yes, my uncle David Slutzkin was also interested in Kabbalah. And then he gave me this book. And he told me, look, he used to talk to me about this. I never understood what he wants. He once took me to a shiur of this rabbi. He said, it's like small Yemenite rabbi. Never understand what he wants. Maybe you will understand it. And that's it. Now, I did not give much attention to it. Only years later, when I was doing actually my BA, I was doing an assignment to Professor Yair Furstenberg. And then in Tosefta Kepshuta, the book of Saul Lieberman, I saw this. This is actually in the Tosefta Kepshuta in Shabbat. And here, as you can see in Hebrew, he actually mentions David Slutzkin. And he mentions that he had a parish on the Mishnah from him. Now, if you know Saul Lieberman, that is very uncommon, that he does something like that. So I was excited, of course, but more or less, I said, all right, if Saul Lieberman knows him, and he talks about him, maybe there's more to the story. And I would say that this research is ongoing, and I would love to hear actually more advice of how to keep it going and how to finish it. So before I start to talk about David, I need to talk about his father, Eliezer Moshe Slutzkin. Now, not Eliezer Moshe Slutzkin is actually a very known figure at the time, and he's very known to historians as well. Basically, he was born in Russia, moved to Australia in the gold rush, married to the very famous family over there, made a lot of money selling women clothing and wool and textile, then came to Israel, built a palace in Rehovot, made connections with the Rav Kook, with the Rav Herzog. His sister is actually married to Shulchan Kook. And then actually was exiled to Egypt because in the time of the First World War, he was actually a Russian citizenship. But his house in the Rehovot was actually at the base for the Anzac forces. Then after that, he moved to England, and that's why we're English today. But it's very interesting because it's very important to mind, because first of all, the history of David is very connected to his father. Second, most of the connections of David is basically because of his father, because his father was a very famous figure. He used to use it as a ground for his connections. And third is, although David was some kind of a mystical figure, he was like his father, some kind of a modern Orthodox with a mystical turn. Now, David himself, there's the best picture I found in a newspaper. It was, as you can see, he was very old when he died. He was born in Melbourne, and exactly like his father, from Melbourne to Egypt, a bit in Israel, and then to Egypt, and then to England. In England, he learned a BA and MA in mathematics in the College of London. That was before, actually, 1948. It's very interesting because in his PhD, he talks about how he was persuaded to go to the lectures of mathematics in State of the Gemara by one of the lectures there. And now it's like, I'm using the mathematics in like a Kodesh thing. And what happened is after he did the college degree, he came to Israel. And he came to Israel in around before 1948. And he actually bought a house in Shtorot Ben Maimon. That's right now here down the street, near the Meridor house. And he stayed there all his life. And I know he was there before 1948 because there's letters from the family in England, actually, that he talks about the siege in Yerushalayim and everything around it. And basically he works in Berkeley's bank all his life until his death, and let's say this is basically his life. Now, before I continue, I want to try and talk who actually knew him, what his connection is. So first of all, as you can see, this is the letter from the Rav of Cook. Very strangely, this is in like the forward page of the PhD. Now, I will say a word about the PhD itself. It's basically David writes Chidushim on the Mishnah and telling stories. And I don't know exactly how it was approved, but let's say it's fine. So as you can see, this letter from the Rav Kook. In the PhD, he started talking about how he knew the Rabbi David Cohen and stuff like that. In the end of it, he talks about how he spoke to David Yelin, and he told him that the word tapuach is actually supposed to be some kind of a citrus, like an orange, tapuz, in English, and David Yelin did not like it. I didn't bring it, but he also talks about the Rav Herzog and all different people there. And the PhD itself, I gotta say, it's not very interesting. It's usually, the PhD is called the mathematics in the Mishnah. It takes different like calculations in the Rovin and Sukkot and Tarot, and it's not very complicated mathematically. What's interesting mostly, it's the stories it tells in between. Now, back to the book, Dudaim Basadeh. The book, the Kabbalistic book they wrote, it called in English, The Flash Flood. That is because of the Sharabian Kabbalah, the Tzochovot and the river. And in the end of the book, it gives acknowledgements. There's been a list of people that was rabbis. Now, some of them, I have no idea who they are. Mostly the people from Melbourne and Alexandria, and even some in London. But the last ones are very well known. So the first one that I know is Moshe Segal. That is actually the Rosh Hashiva of Manchester. Is very famous actually in England, here in Israel quite less. He was a student of the Sharabian of Ardok. He was some kind of a tzaddik in Manchester to give blessings. Furthermore, it's Shimon Lider Horowitz. Shimon Lider Horowitz is actually the Kabbalist who co-founded Rosh Hashiva Sha'ar HaShamayim. The one after that is Yaakov Munsa. Yaakov Munsa is actually a Chalabi Kabbalist they went to learn with. Interestingly enough, actually his books are circling around. And I saw a Sidur Kavanot of David that he writes things that he heard from Yaakov Munsa. Now Yaakov Munsa is actually, as I said, is a Chalabi Kabbalist. Actually a student of Rav Shul Dwika Cohen, also had a bit of a fight. And after probably he passed away, he moved to the Rav Mordechai Sharabi. That is also a very famous Kabbalist here in Yerushalayim in the Shuk. And as you can see, it basically goes, as you can see, the further on is like more, let's say, doctors and rabbis, and as it goes along, it becomes more rabbis and Kabbalist. Now let's go to the book itself. Sorry. Now the book itself, The Flash Flood, is very, first of all, it's in English. And that's quite strange. I don't know of any other books, particularly this time, that try to explain some ideas of Sharabian Kabbalah in English. And I think there isn't one until today, by the way, that try to do something like that. The book itself, David does not say his name. He called himself Dudaim Basadeh. I don't know why. And in the beginning of the book, there's two people that actually write the preference. One is Naftali Ben Israel, that I have no idea who he is. The other one is Dr. Yosef David, that I also have no idea who this guy is. He was a doctor, but what we know him from the preference, we know a few things about him. We know, first of all, he was a doctor, so this means he was educated. Second, he was an English speaker, like David. Third, he was also a student of Rav Mordechai Sharabi, because he calls him the teacher. And then in the preface it says why he wrote the book, why David wrote the book. And he gives a testimony, basically, that a Jerusalem Kabbalist asked David to write this book. Who this Jerusalem Kabbalist? I think probably Mordechai Sharabi, because that's the first thing. And the reason he has to do that is because he wants to bring people to learn Sharabian Kabbalah. And furthermore, it says this is because to fight the growing this is because this is to fight the mice that grow in the interpretations of insanity in the flash flood. This fighting against the irresponsibility. And what it means here basically is because there's lots of books in Kabbalah that is published, so they have to like take most of the Sharabian Kabbalah bit out to fight, let's say, the misinterpretations, a different Kabbalistic view. Now this preference, I think, for my opinion, is a bit very, how to say this correctly, important. The reason is, first of all, we know David was not alone. There was other people from English descent and very educated that came to learn Kabbalah with a Mordechai Sharabi. And the second is, we learned that the Kabbalists in Jerusalem, although they were a bit closed group, wanted fame and wanted people to know what they're doing and wanted people to come to learn with them. Now the book itself, I gotta say, is not very well written. And David himself writes in the end of the book that is intentional, that is because they have to keep things esoteric and they have to keep things hidden. But basically the books, that's how it is. It's like indexes, and then it gives explanations what they are. And as you can see, I think personally, I don't think it's very easy to read this book in English and general. But as you can see, it's although he tried to keep it esoteric, it doesn't have the fit to go to very complex Kabbalistic ideas. As you can see here about the powers of the names, or here the fundamental rule, that he talks about the different sources of the neshama according to the Sharabi law, about the auras, this is what you call the tzelem in English, and in Hebrew, sorry, and now he goes on. I did not bring in here, he also talks a lot about, how to say this, the pathos of the Sharabian Kabbalistic. It's very important to everybody in this book to say that the Sharabian Kabbalists are some kind of saints that comes in the morning after the mikveh, and this is how Kabbalah is supposed to be. In the end of the book, there's another treaty. This is actually part of modern Kabbalah, Kabbalah in modern science. And he actually wrote it in 1940, no, before World War II. And I gotta say again, this is very brief. He writes about 3 subjects, about astronomy, about psychology, and also about cosmology. And this is what the type of what I can call is the Jews said it first. Meaning, modern science just found out, yeah, but we know it from our like secret teachings way back. And this is very interesting because it's those kind of things go back to the Middle Ages. So I did not bring the different two about psychology. In the part of psychology, what he wants to say, and this is, by the way, this is how short it is. It's only 2 pages. He brings Carl Jung about this idea that all humanity have some kind of a shared subconscious. And he says basically, yeah, we the Kabbalists knew this because all the souls came from the first Adam. So this is our idea as well. So basically in the end, I will finish this lecture with the question is why this story is important. It's very interesting. It's quite peculiar. Of a Kabbalist that goes around, talk to David Yalin and Charles Lieberman, and say stuff like that. But is it more interesting than the story itself? And I think yes and no. I can't really say that David was a very important figure. Not like my other article about like Meir Mina, who was a very important figure and was unknown because of his life story. David kept to be unknown because he was a secondary figure that goes around. But he does have his fame. First of all, he gave us a pimp to the world that nobody knew about, of people of English descent, and actually, or European descent, that were actually very well educated, that come to learn here in Yerushalayim with the Rav Mordechai Sharabi and the Rav Yaakov Munza. And as I said, he's not the only one. And they found some kind of a magic into this. That's first. The second thing is, here's the first attempt to try to teach Sharabian Kabbalah in English. And I think that until today, with the Rav Moshe Schatz, the Rav Yitzchak Morgenstern, this attempt was not tried ever since. And the third one, it gives us some glimpse to even to the Kabbalistic Jerusalem itself. The idea that the Kabbalistic in Jerusalem wanted, in many ways, they like played like a double game. They said, oh, we want to keep it hidden, we want to keep it in our circles as well. But in the, let's say in English, maybe because they wanted donations, but in English, they wanted people to know what they were doing. And they tried, although not very successfully through David, through other things, to publish what they are doing. So I think that's it.
אז טוב, אז תודה רבה לברק. כן, אפשר לשאול גם באנגלית וגם בעברית. נתחיל.
Yeah, and also because I want to widen the context a bit in England. First of all, thank you very much. It's certainly an interesting story. A person who did probably more to propagate Kabbalah in England and Chassidut before Adar Rappaport, let's say, was Rabbi Louis Jacobs. And he, in his book Jewish Mystical Testimonies, which is quite an early book, he brings at the end, one of the testimonies is from somebody, I think the name probably maybe escapes me, I think Ben-Zion Ariel, who's very similar in the sort of Ariel Ben-Zion, the sort of pathos about Kabbalistic Kabbalat Rashash. And since I once owned a copy of this book, where I decided not to keep it, which maybe was a mistake, but maybe not, they seem also to share a certain ignorance of the details of Kabbalat Rashash. So both authors. So I think maybe there's a wider story. Maybe I don't know if there's any connection between these three figures, Louis Jacobs, English, and Ariel Ben-Zion, and your hero.
I don't think there's a connection between him and Ariel Ben-Zion, but the difference is Ariel Ben-Zion did not know Sharabian Kabbalah. He knows only the stories. He knew.
How much?
How much he knew Sharabian Kabbalah? I think quite well. Like, he has his comments on Shidurei Kavanot, also his comments on the Tzchaim. Even here, it's going into detail that most people don't know. Basically. In English, so it's not very convenient to read, I gotta say, but yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. You spoke about the relationship with Manchester. Do you know if there is a relationship in Professor Altman, who was, as you know, from Hungarian and Berlin, and then Manchester, and then Brandeis? It's the first question. The second question, Slutzkin wanted to go als Professor or Marche באוניברסיטה העברית או לא?
No, he wasn't lecturing at the University, just did his PhD there. And he did the PhD on the supervision of Avraham Goldberg. That makes more sense. But Professor Altman, I think my family doesn't know who he is. So I would say no.
אני בכל זאת בעברית. דבר שלא תודה, יש לך את הכישרון הזה לעלות על הדברים המעניינים, עם כל כמה שזה שולי וכולי, אני חושב שיש כאן הרבה ללמוד. כמה דברים מהשאלות, דבר ראשון, ההתייחסות להפצה של קבלה שמעוררת אותו לכתוב, אני מניח שהוא מדבר על שולם, כלומר שזה הדברים. הערה, אני חושב שיש עוד כמה דמויות, פסקל תימנליס שמגיע מצרפת וגם כן מתקרב, חבל שיונתן לא כאן, נכון? כבר לא כאן, בסדר, אבל אז כנראה היה איזשהו ככה דמויות שהגיעו לחוגי, בניגוד לשולם שכל כך זלזל בהם, היו כמה אנשים שהגיעו אולי מאזורים תרבותיים אחרים ובכל זאת חיפשו מקובלים אמיתיים, כן, והם הגיעו אליהם. אז זה מעניין שיש עוד, אני מניח שאולי יש עוד. שאלה מבחינת מחוץ לקבלה, ראיתי שם התייחסות לפסיכולוגיה, השימוש שלו במונח אורה, מעניין לאיזה עולמות תרבות עוד הוא מקשר את זה. כלומר הוא מתעניין במיסטיקה, ספיריטואליזם או...
לגבי זה שיש עוד אנשים, אני חייב לומר שזה כן מאוד מעניין, ואני כן מניח שיש עוד, ואני כן מניח שדווקא בגלל שזה מאוד אסוטרי, זה מאוד כזה הרגשה, זה גם הרגשה שלהם, שזה הקבלה האמיתית שנשמרה בסוד, ושאף אחד לא נגע בה, ואנחנו עכשיו קצת נתאר אותה את העולם. האם זה נכון או לא? לא יודע. לגבי העולמות התרבותיים, בסוף היה לו חינוך מדעי. לאו דווקא של מדעי הרוח, ואני חייב גם לומר שהרבה פעמים דווקא באנשים בחוגים האלה של האורתודוקסיה המודרנית, יש איזו נטייה מאוד נגד מדעי הרוח. אין בעיה ללמוד מדעים רגילים, אבל מדעי הרוח זה קצת זה. אני יכול לספר לך סיפור אישי, שסבא שלי רצה ללמוד היסטוריה באוניברסיטה, ואב שלו לא הסכים לו. אבל אני רוצה ללמוד משהו אחר, סבבה. כאילו, הוא דיבר איתי על זה, שאני התחלתי זה, הוא אמר לי, אתה עושה את החלום שלי וזה וזה. אז כן, העולם התרבות שלי זה עולם מדעי, הוא גם, לא אמרתי את זה, אבל הוא גם עזר לערוך כל מיני ספרים מדעיים באנגלית. ואני חושב שזה מה שבעיקר עניין אותו. כלומר, התעסקות בפסיכולוגיה, זה היה אפיזודה שהוא מצא משהו דומה, וזהו. זה לדעתי, הוא בעיקר כאילו היה מתמטיקאי, פיזיקאי וכו'.
טוב, תודה רבה. יש עוד? אז תודה רבה לברק. טוב, אז ההרצאה הבאה שלנו היא בזום, נכון? אז our third speaker is Dr. J.J. Kimchi, Assistant Professor of Religion and Philosophy and the founding faculty member at the University of Austin, Texas. Dr. Kimchi received his PhD in Jewish intellectual history from Harvard University and recently published an annotated translation of Shadal's Vikuach of Chochmat HaKabbalah. He will speak about the missionary and the mystics David Ginsburg reconception of Kabbalah. בבקשה, JJ.
Thank you very much to all those who organized the conference. Thank you to the Yoshev Grosh and all those who are involved in putting this together. It's been a wonderful experience. So my subject today is actually one of the most fascinating and unusual figures, intellectuals of the 19th century, a man known by the name Christian David Ginsburg. Now, if you hear a name like Christian David Ginsburg, immediately you stop and you think, hang on, that's an unusual name. What is a name like Christian Ginsburg doing here? It's as I tell my students when I talk about this, it's like meeting someone with the name Muhammad Goldberg. You immediately say, hang on, there's something strange there. There's a story behind the name. What's going on here? So Christian David Ginsburg was a Jew who was born in Warsaw. He was obviously born David or David Ginsburg in the year 1825, and he was born into a Maskilic family, into a family of sort of middle class merchants in Warsaw in Poland, and he received an education in the Warsaw Rabbinical Seminary, as it's known in English, which was the great, I would say, a Maskilic educational experiment of the 19th century Warsaw. So he grew up, learning both a very deep engagement with sort of a broad secular education, including languages, including history, including mathematics and sciences, etc. But he was also involved and also got a very deep education in the full range of Jewish subjects as well. And he was also then in his school in Warsaw, he was also exposed to a wide array of Christian missionaries, mainly from an English missionary outfit called the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews, an Anglican missionary organization, which amazingly was very active in the Catholic Eastern Europe. And at a certain point, he was very interested, and eventually at the age of 21, in 1846, he converted to Christianity, and he moved from Warsaw to England, where he became, his mother was English, and he became a missionary in England, first in London, and then in Liverpool for a while. And at a certain point, he married a couple of times and into wealthy families, and he settled down at some point and became the great Hebraist of Victorian England. So he wrote an enormous amount about the entire array of Jewish and Hebrew texts and subjects, specifically the Hebrew Bible. He wrote very important commentaries on Shir Hashirim and Kohelet. He's also known as in the 19th century as the great scholar of the biblical Masorah. And he wrote a massive 4-volume treatise on Masorah, and he became not only a great intellectual figure of Victorian England, but also a great figure within the upper class social circles in London. So he was very close to the Prime Minister William Gladstone and the poet Alfred North Tennyson and various other figures as well. And so Christian David Ginsburg became, through both social connections and through his astonishing scholarship and just sheer luck, I think, became one of the most influential sort of cultural and intellectual figures of the time, which is an extraordinary thing for a Jewish boy who was born in Poland. This is more or less unheard of. And if your name wasn't Rothschild, so then if you were born a Jew, there was almost no way that you'd find yourself in such exalted circles in Victorian England at the very height of the British Empire. But that's what Ginsburg found himself. Now, why is he important to us today? It's because of a book that he wrote in the year 1865. So in 1865, he released a book called The Kabbalah, Its Doctrines, Development, and Literature. And it was one of his earlier books, though he'd written quite a few books beforehand. And it stands today still as the first rigorous and I would say well-informed introduction to Kabbalah in the English language. In other words, of course, during the mid-19th century, a vast majority of scholarship that existed at the time was written either in German or French. And Christian David Ginsburg could be rightly credited as one of the first very important Jewish studies scholars writing in English, but also, I think, probably the very first insider, meaning someone who read Kabbalistic texts in their original Aramaic and the original Hebrew, who understood the world of the Talmud and the world of Kabbalah from the inside, got a very serious Jewish education. And he was the first person to try and undertake this act of cultural and linguistic translation of the concepts and of the texts that he knew from his time and also from his time in Eastern Europe and Poland into this new Victorian English-speaking society, and to try and present Kabbalah. So what we're going to do a little bit today in the presentation is to attempt to describe Ginsburg's book, to note what is interesting about it and how he seeks to undertake this sort of act of cultural translation, and also to and the various ways in which this particular project sheds light on Ginsburg's larger projects and also some of the intellectual trends of the mid-19th century. Of course, it is unnecessary to state that of all areas of Jewish endeavor, let's say in the 19th century, Kabbalah is really one of the least well regarded by the 1860s. In other words, both among non-Jewish scholars, most of whom saw it as a really almost unforgivably superstitious and backward-looking part of Jewish intellectual history, and also many of the Jewish scholars at the time. You read the works of Heinrich Gretz or of Moritz Steinschneider or of Adolf Jelinek, all of these the great Kabbalah scholars of the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. Many of these figures also present Kabbalah in a decidedly negative light. Not all of them; it's not uniform, but generally it's presented as decidedly negative light. One of the fascinating things about Ginsburg, as we're going to see, is that he seeks to, in a large part, undo the damage, so to speak. In other words, not only is he presenting Kabbalah, but he's also actually, in a way, trying to defend it, or at least present it in as palatable light as possible for his Christian Anglophone readers. It's okay. Just very briefly, in terms of Ginsburg, the point in his life that Ginsburg gives over also he writes this book. This book originated actually as a lecture that he gave in 1863 as part of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Liverpool. Right, so he was then living in Liverpool, which was the second largest, most important city in the United Kingdom, and he joined the major society of sort of gentlemen scholars who got together about once a month and talked about science and history and literature and all the major new fields that were arising in the mid 19th century. And quite quickly he was elected to the vice president, eventually became president. But in the year 1863, as the vice president, October 7th, he gave a very lengthy lecture, which he took 2 years to expand into this book. What is interesting is that already by then, Ginsburg was quite a considerable name within English and European scholarship. He'd already published several significant works, and in 5 years after this book was published, he was invited to be part of the committee for revising the translation of the Old Testament. So in 1870, a committee of churchmen and academics and bishops got together to produce 17 of them to produce the revised version of the King James Bible. Right, so we're talking about a significant national endeavor within England, and it's of course a signal honor that Ginsburg was invited, and this is only 5 years after this particular book and this particular lecture was given. So already then he was considered, fairly well known, fairly substantial, and it's firstly interesting that he decided to turn his attention to Kabbalah and also to write about it in English and to present it to his Anglophone audience. So what does Ginsburg do? What does this book try and do with Kabbalah? So firstly, very briefly, just to describe the book's internal three-part architecture. So the first is he starts off with what I would call doctrinal overview. In other words, he believes there are certain central principles or ideas upon which Kabbalah is based, and seeks to describe them. And then the second part of the book is a textual survey. So he goes through the major texts, including the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer HaBahir, of course, the Sefer HaZohar, and there he also presents all the arguments against the antiquity of the Sefer HaZohar, which comprise an important part of the book there as well. And finally, the third part is he gives a historical timeline. So he traces Kabbalah from its very earliest texts in the 12th century in France and Provence area, all the way until his own day, until the mid 1800s. That's very typical actually of Ginsberg. He likes to give a historical timeline where he briefly outlines all the major stops along the way. One or two very brief parts of the book before I get onto the main content. He writes with tremendous clarity and verve. He also translates substantial passages of the Zohar into English. I think this is very interesting because this is the very first time this has been done. And I think that actually Ginsberg has gone quite uncredited in the history of Zohar translations. He didn't translate the whole Zohar, but he gives several substantial passages in the footnotes and actually gives an English rendition in the main body of the text. I will point out one very serious translation mistake he makes later on, but generally they're actually pretty good translations. I think that Ginsberg deserves at least a footnote, if not a paragraph, in sort of histories of translation and cultural transmutation of the Zohar as is. And of course, and a very interesting thing that Ginsberg does right at the beginning of his book is to note how all the previous efforts in English to describe Kabbalah by scholars in the 1830s, 1840s, also a little bit before, firstly were all inferior, but also relied on Latin translations of Kabbalistic texts. Norv von Rosenroth and others who had published Latin translations of Kabbalistic texts in the 18th century, and many previous scholars writing in English. And Ginsberg, one of the things that he prides himself is that he is the first one to present Kabbalah as is, sort of an unmediated, direct reading of the Kabbalistic texts as they are. Okay, so a few points. One important point that must be made about this particular representation is Ginsberg gives Kabbalah an essentialist treatment. And what I mean by that is the first part of the book is a description of some core doctrines which Ginsberg takes to be the essence of Kabbalah. In other words, he believes that any Kabbalistic text that is to be included under the rubric of what we call Kabbalah must address 8 core topics. I mean, they are fairly readily identifiable. The doctrine of Ein Sof, the Sfirot, the emanation, the 4 worlds, the origin of the soul, reincarnation, the ultimate restoration of the soul and of the whole world, etc., etc. And he presents that as sort of the core doctrinal ideas, and all Kabbalistic texts must address this and must come out of this. Now, what is interesting about this at first is that Ginsberg, in doing this, is actually very much at odds with other major Jewish scholars of the Kabbalah of his day, namely Heinrich Gretz and Moritz Steinschneider, whose works repeatedly emphasize that Kabbalah is a very loose constellation of texts and not a set of doctrines. In other words, for these other Germanic scholars who were the leading scholars of Kabbalah at the time, they would constantly state over and over again that basically what we're talking about when we talk about Kabbalah is sort of a very loosely defined and just a general constellation of barely related texts, very difficult to provide any essential definition of them. But for Ginsberg, he actually says, no, on the contrary, first comes the philosophical definitions and the precise ideas, and all texts that we consider Kabbalah must relate to those ideas. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, is that it allows him to draw distinctions between true, quote unquote, true Kabbalah and various other marginal or magical traditions which got subsumed under the same name. In other words, one of the things that Ginsberg, and again, as I said before, he repeatedly tries to do throughout the book and throughout his writings, is to rationalize and systematize Kabbalah to the extent possible. And basically, Ginsberg's point is that there are certain books which should be considered Kabbalah proper, and then there is an accretion of various other works. He dismisses, for example, Lurianic Kabbalah and the works of Luria. He doesn't consider that to be Kabbalistic at all, for the same reason that I mentioned above. It doesn't systematically address the set of topics that he believed ought to be addressed. They're too practical, they're too magical, etc., and can be dismissed at that. Also, Ginsberg, through providing this sort of philosophical definition of Kabbalah, what he allows him to do, and this is probably one of the biggest innovations of his book, is to essentially claim that Kabbalah is simply part of the overall patchwork of medieval religious philosophy, right? In other words, and Ginsberg on a few occasions, for example, likens the ideas very sharply to medieval Neoplatonic ideas and sort of spells this out about the various Sfirot and Paratzufim and how they're very close to different emanations as the medieval Neoplatonists believed. And by doing that, what he does is is implicitly, at the very least, making the case that Kabbalah is to be respected as a legitimate bona fide member of the medieval religious a set of ideas, right? Not substantially different to various kinds of mysticism you'll find in Christianity and in various other religions as well. And by doing so, basically saying this is a medieval religious philosophy that he himself doesn't subscribe to, but is not atypical for the medieval world. That's very interesting and important as well. And the first thing he tries to do is to state that there is something very definite and identifiable called Kabbalah, that we can boil it down to its essential doctrines, and that those doctrines are actually very similar to other religious doctrines you'll find at the time, and therefore it's not something immensely or unbridgeably foreign, something that is sort of mystical or scary or recondite, or any of these things that sort of that many Christian, even Jewish authors accuse Kabbalah of being. It's just it's a form of medieval Neoplatonic philosophy with a bit of other elements thrown in as well. That's sort of an important part of what he does there. And that's important. Another important aspect, and this builds a little bit about of what a little bit of what I said before, is that this book, published in 1865, it comes on the back of what one might be called a kind of golden age of Kabbalah scholarship in the mid-19th century, right? So starting around the age of 1840, around the year 1840 or so, figures like Adolf Jelinek, figures like Heinrich Gretz and Landauer and Steinschneider and various others had been publishing the first major wave of Kabbalah scholarship, almost entirely in German, but there were, including the unearthing of major manuscripts, including the first big bibliographies from Steinschneider and categorizations from Gretz and others, and this is, and Ginsburg is coming off the last quarter century or so of this major explosion, shall we say, and really foundation of modern Kabbalah studies. And what's very important here is that Ginsburg is aware of this. And not only that, Ginsburg, throughout his book, keeps referring to these Jewish scholars on the continent and praises their works and sort of joins in the debate regarding their works and sort of sees himself as on a continuum with their works. And what's fascinating is, among many other things, is that Ginsburg, aside from sort of staking his claim, his place in that history of Wissenschaftes Judentum, in that corner of Jewish studies, among other things, he is presenting the Jewish scholars of the Wissenschaft movement as the cutting-edge scholars of this discipline. What's fascinating is, of course, is that Wissenschaft scholars in general, and various others have written on this, were frequently derided or frequently dismissed on the continent. In other words, their works by Protestant, by Christian authors, by Christian academics, were not seen as particularly substantial. Always was often dismissed, was often seen as a kind of irrelevant or not within the best traditions of German Wissenschaft. Whereas what Ginsburg is saying here is that actually here we have a discipline, namely medieval Jewish mysticism. All the Christian writers who have written on this have produced inferior works. They don't know the original text. They don't read the original language, etc. And specifically, the Jewish authors who have written on this subject are the cutting edge. They are, in fact, the best. They are, in fact, superior in terms of their production of knowledge within this. And therefore, what Ginsburg is doing in this book is now twofold. Firstly, he's introducing Kabbalah as a discipline into his Anglophone Victorian world and sort of rationalizing it, systematizing it, presenting it as a form of religious philosophy. That's the first level. But the second level, what he's doing is he's presenting his contemporary Jewish scholars, people who he's writing to and people who he's having back and forth with, the Gretz and the Steinschneiders, etc., from the on the continent. He's presenting them as genuine, bona fide scholars producing the highest level European style philological historical scholarship on the matter, far vastly superior to the Christian world as well. So he's introducing Kabbalah into the Anglophone Victorian world. It's also introducing Wissenschaftes Judentums and Jewish scholarship, European Jewish scholarship in general into the Anglophone European world, which is again a considerable contribution. And there were, so far as I can tell, in the 1860s, that was very, very unusual, certainly in the English language, but just in Christian scholarship in general, to point to the Jewish coterie of Jewish scholars and say they are the gold standard of this particular discipline. That is, so far as I can tell, extremely unusual and interesting and worthy of our attention. Okay, so a few. Another couple of points. It's very interesting that throughout Ginsburg's works, he is unusual as a convert to Christianity in the sense that he frequently defends Judaism and Jews from attacks that were leveled against them by Christians in the 19th century. Now, this is a very long and interesting topic. I don't have time to go into it. Overall, you sort of have to trust me on this. But throughout Ginsburg's many, many works, he is what I call an autophilo-Semite. Right? This is a word I think that I've coined because there's lots of auto-anti-Semites, meaning Jews who were Jews converted to Christianity who hate Jews or have a serious dislike of Judaism. There's no shortage of that. But Christian David Ginsburg is one of the foremost representatives of a sort of an English Christian Hebraist philo-Semitic strand of scholarship, which goes out of its way over and over again to try and defend Jews and try and defend Jewish honor. And he does so throughout his works. And in this book, this is noticeable. So I'll give two examples of how he does. I mean, or three. One of them I already mentioned, which is to sort of rationalize the Kabbalah to the extent possible and present it as a member of the medieval religious set of worldviews, not substantially different from many of the others. The second one is that it's a very interesting point in his book, in 1865 book on Kabbalah, is that when Ginsburg comes across, he discusses certain magical or thaumaturgic elements of Kabbalah, he almost immediately and instinctively notes that there are other Jewish counterweights to this particular view, right? So a few times, for example, he'll invoke Rambam, he'll invoke Maimonides in his Guide of the Perplexed, and sort of present him as a counterweight to the point he's discussing. He says, there are Kabbalists who believe, for instance, in the apotropaic power, in the long distance power of certain divine names, and then he brings a paragraph from the Guide of the Perplexed saying, this is actually not true, and real Jewish philosophy in the medieval period did not believe this, right? He brings in rationalist Jewish sources to counterbalance what he sees as excesses, let's say, ideological excesses of the medieval Kabbalists, which is, again, he didn't have to do this. This wasn't something that is demanded in the book of Kabbalah, but you can see Ginsburg almost instinctively trying to bring in the sort of rationalist counterweight to show that, the Jewish tradition wasn't, let's say, uniformly mystical, uniformly irrationalist. And the second thing he does, which I think is also very interesting, is that in his timeline, Kabbalah, et cetera, what he also does is he gives quite significant weight and description to those elements of Jewish scholarship which ran counter to Kabbalah or which doubted or which cast aspersions on the antiquity and authenticity. So, for example, he brings lengthy paragraphs on Yehuda Arya of Modena and his book Ari Nohem, Antor of Yaakov Emden, and his book Mitpachat Sfarim, and others into elements within the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and also Wissenschaft, who sort of knew about Kabbalah, but also cast aspersions on it. And it's funny because he presents them, these voices that I mentioned, as major authorities, major voices within the Jewish world of the early modern period. And of course, those who are more familiar with the history know that these actually were quite marginal voices. In other words, the rise of Kabbalah in the 17th, 18th century was quite meteoric and opposed by relatively few in the rabbinic world. But Ginsburg gives heavy voice and serious weight to those voices, again, in an effort to portray Jewish intellectual history as let's say, more rationalistic, more critical, closer to his own version of enlightened religious philosophy than would otherwise be evident in, let's say, just a pure history of the Kabbalah. So there's a couple kind of ways that the Ginsburg does this. Now, this book is interesting for reflecting Ginsburg's relationship with Judaism.
I'm trying to stop you just a second. We run out of time, so please 2 minutes, okay?
Oh, okay. I see. Sorry, I thought I had longer. Fine, I will, in which case, fine, I will say this last point very, very quickly. It's an important point to make, which is that Ginsburg, throughout this book, gives attention to some of the major Christian scholars of the 16th century who were great Christian Hebraists and who were also very interested in Kabbalah. So, for example, Johannes Reuchlin and Pico della Mirandola. But what is interesting is that in his discussion of Christian Kabbalah, what he does is he also states very clearly, very importantly, that the kinds of the kinds of Kabbalistic works that they were doing at the time, the kind of drashot and the kind of hermeneutical techniques that these Christian scholars had, in his own day, Ginsburg says, in the 19th century have no place, right? In other words, he seeks, on one hand, to understand Christian Kabbalistic scholarship, but also to dismiss it in favor of what he calls the laws of language. In other words, Ginsburg's religious loyalties or fealties were on the one hand to traditional religious ideas and doctrines, but also he was very much a religious and a member of the 19th century guild of academics, and he saw that any type or any field, let's say, of religious scholarship which did not conform to what he called the laws of language, in other words, the tools of history, the tools of philology, the tools of the modern scholar, those that did not conform to that could be admired from a distance, could be seen as like an interesting step in the history of medieval or early modern learning, but could not be admitted to be serious, real religious scholarship, could not be seen to be something that a modern Christian is, him speaking as a Christian, ought to embrace, and therefore he deprecates, he dismisses, and says, I'll quote one line: "The use made by well-meaning Christians of the above-named Kabbalistic canons of interpretation in controversy with Jews to prove that the doctrines of Christianity are concealed under the letter of the Old Testament will now be deprecated by everyone who has any regard for the laws of language." In other words, he's stating that the kind of late medieval, early modern Christian Kabbalah, even though impressive, even though important in the role of converting Jews, again, Ginsburg was a missionary. He believed in this mission of converting Jews. He also believed that doing so under the kinds of Kabbalistic modes of interpretation that he saw as superseded by modern scholarship, he viewed that to be admirable, but yet have to be pushed aside, have to be deprecated, because the sort of new wave of scholarship of his own time, to which he was a sort of self-professed member, had superseded, had successfully suppressed and supplanted those methods of textual learning and scholarship which were sort of held to in previous times. I wish I had more time. I thought I had a little bit more time to develop this point. And an article on this is coming out soon in the Journal of American Academy of Religion, and will be part of a monograph that hopefully will come out next year. So anyone wants to read about it will have a chance in due course. But thank you very much for allowing me to participate, and this has been a great pleasure. And thank you.
So thank you, JJ. And now, if someone have a question.
Hi, it's Boaz Hus. Well, as I wrote you before, I was looking for someone who will do work on Christian Ginsburg, and I'm thrilled that you're doing it and hearing. Maybe just a few comments, and I'm sure we'll continue. One, I think that there's some kind of a resemblance between him and Adolf Frank in their approach. And it's interesting because both of them are somehow related to Wissenschaft, but also peripheral to Wissenschaft, especially linguistically and geographically. And I think that's significant, French and English.
Yeah.
Maybe another point is that you didn't mention, maybe you will, the identification of Kabbalah as theosophy, which is very, that's how he opens. He's not the first, but definitely I think there are three people who brought it as a central theme, and possibly quite independently. And that is Christian Ginsburg, Elia ben Amozag, more or less at the same time, not reading English. So it's not, and I think probably before him. And the third is Sholem, which I'm not sure that how much he leaned on Ginsburg at that point, but that's very interesting. And of course, today we're all speaking about Kabbalah as theosophy, so we should give the credit to Christian Ginsburg for that. And the third point that, you put him as a central figure, and I think you're doing it, that's right to put him on the map. I think that the major impact of Christian Ginsburg, and that's how I encountered him, is his huge impact on esoteric and occult circles, and through them on Western culture, which I think, thinking about Madame Blavatsky and other people I mentioned, that's who they read Eliphaz Levi and they read Ginsburg. And those who knew French read also Adolf Frank. And really his impact is immense. And that, from that point of view, actually the name of the Theosophical Society, Blavatsky herself admits that she chose it after reading Ginsburg and his identification with. So just some comments, and thank you very much for introducing Christian Ginsburg at the end of this conference, because I think he's really a central figure in Kabbalah and modernity, and not well known, and definitely not researched until you came in the scene. So thank you very much.
Thank you, firstly, and many important and interesting comments. You're 100% right. Just one or 2 points. So yes, Ginsburg does introduce that term theosophy. And yes, you're right, it is taken up by others, Helena Blavatsky, for example, and the whole Theosophical Society in the United States. There's a very rich and important history in that, and of course you've written and others have written on this subject. Others have also took up Ginsburg's Kabbalah. For instance, the English author George Eliot, right? So she writes this book, Daniel Deronda, in which the main figure is this guy Mordechai, who is kind of a Kabbalist, and he mentions many parts of Kabbalah, and we actually have the diaries and the journals of George Eliot as she's writing the book, and she is quoting whole paragraphs in her journal from Ginsburg. Well, she's writing out sentences from Ginsburg's book and then putting it into her Daniel Deronda, which is, of course, a very important early Christian Zionist book and Philo-Semitic book. So there are echoes. And in fact, this is noted by Shalom himself. So later on, Shalom, in Origins of Kabbalah, notes, he just throws away one sentence, which is that many scholars have relied on Ginsburg without quoting him. He just sort of puts that in a sentence and leaves it. It's annoying. He doesn't elaborate who he thinks are the scholars who came after Ginsburg who relied on Ginsburg's descriptions but don't credit him. So I don't actually know who he's referring to, and maybe there's no way of knowing. You mentioned Eliyahu ben Mozeg that Ginsburg that he also used this term. That's very interesting. One of the oddities of Ginsburg's book, the 1865 book, is he does not mention the Hebraic scholarship, the Hebrew language scholarship in Kabbalah at the time, which is very interesting because, for example, he's writing only 12 years after Shmuel David Lutzato, Shadal, released his Vikuach Chochmat Kabbalah, right, which I've translated, which was an important book at the time. He was writing a couple of years after Ben Mozeg's response to it, Tam Lashad. He's writing quite a bit after Eliakim Hamilzagi also wrote on Kabbalah in his works. And Ginsburg knew all these works. He references Shadal and Hamilzagi elsewhere. And it's very curious that Ginsburg does not reference the Hebrew language scholarship of the late Maskilim of the time. I think because, again, he's working for an Anglophone audience for whom German and French would be a serious language of scholarship, Hebrew less so, and therefore he wants to, I don't know, maybe manage expectations. I don't know why, but it is curious. I'm almost 100% certain he'd read Shadal. I know he'd seen Hamilzagi because he quotes a part of the bibliography of Steinsteiner that quotes Hamilzagi, but yeah, it's curious that he doesn't mention the Hebrew language scholarship on that. But yes, the something that I only addressed briefly in my article, my chapter, my dissertation on Ginsburg is the sort of his being quoted and referenced by others, including Theosophical Society and George Eliot. But that is worthy of more digging, and that should be sort of that should be explored further. I 100% agree.
Thank you so much, JJ. It was fascinating. כן, תודה רבה, ונסגור את המושב. תודה רבה על המושב הזה. ברק ואביעד, שכבר לא כאן. אביעד נסע. אז באמת להאיר את הקבלה מאזורים ככה מאוד מאוד מעניינים, ההתקבלות במרחבים השונים. אני בזה מסיימת. מזמינה שוב את כולם להיכנס להרצאה של אליוט וולפסון. נכון, ותודה רבה לאסף. ולכם כמובן, לארגון. תודה לכם שהחזיקה את האונייה הזאת. לגמרי, אז תודה חן.